Hello, this is Synergetics Livestream number 17.2. It's January 15th, 2023. This presentation slash stream is called William Blake and Buckminster Fuller, Lives in Juxtaposition, A Study in Comprehensivity. And this is 17.2 because 17.1 was at 52 Living Ideas, a video channel, on January 8th, 2023, and meetup group. And that event, meetup, was part of a series on Buckminster Fuller. So check out that video, 52 Living Ideas, look for Blake, and there's more of some context provided by Shrikant, and also insights and questions from other participants at that event 1 week ago. So I thought I would go for a solo 17.2 because the slides were already there. Nothing has changed from the slides from the other presentation. But just to go through it alone and see how long it takes, just do it in a different way. So the roadmap of this talk is as follows. First, there will be one slide on context, one slide on comprehensivity, a variable number of slides on Blake and Fuller in juxtaposition, the main substance of the section, and then one slide on the conclusion and discussion. So first, for the context. On the top left, this is a picture of part of our apartment, and the top shelf is Blake, the middle shelf here is Fuller, and in both cases towards the left side are some of their compiled works and original works, and towards the right side is secondary work and biographies and related uses of their work in different ways. So that's a few really awesome works. In general, I'll try to provide links. The slides are downloadable in the video description to the sources for a lot of what I'll show, and just wanted to upfront show some general resources, including some that were hard to directly get into the slides. So in terms of general online resources for Blake, the Blake Archive and Quarterly and various sources of complete work exist. And for Fuller, there are various groups and individuals that have a lot of good information and resources. BFI, CJ Fearnley, Trim Tab Reading Group, Kirby Erner, Kurt McNamara, R.W. Gray, Stroopy Poll, many others. This is Synergetics Stream 17.2, so I guess there's a playlist of 17 videos so far, now maybe 18, and that's related to Synergetics texts, but one of the earlier streams had a preliminary juxtaposition of Blake and Fuller, which these slides kind of generated to zoom in on. And as with last week, it's a draft snapshot, just saying it like I'm trying to see it. And there's various ways that we can connect and move forward in this kind of a juxtaposition or in other juxtapositions that people see. So developing along the lines of practices of inquiry and action, connecting with the lives of others, Kandinsky, Goethe, Sri Aurobindo, Krishnamurti, Friston, others. Building ontologies for Fuller and Synergetics, as well as Blake, connecting with active inference ontology, others. Connections with multimedia, philosophical, analytical, mathematical, and practical systems. So what do we do with this juxtaposition? The intention and attention in this talk is comprehensivity. Comprehensivity is something that will unfold through our participation and engagement across multiple scales. We can explore it more in the discussion section and in more times ahead. And comprehensivity is introduced, or at least most recently phrased, by C.J. Fearnley. C.J. wrote, "Comprehensivity is our ability to comprehend our worlds broadly and deeply. It is a facility in questioning, conceptualizing, interpreting, and acting to build a multi-perspectival yet integrated understanding of the world, how it works, and how it changes. It is the quality of our lives that shapes all we have learned in breadth for context and all we have learned in depth for clarity to form. As Buckminster Fuller put it, adequately macro-comprehensive and micro-incisive considerations to better engage our worlds and its peoples with understanding and effectiveness." So, see CJ's work and ongoing other topics to learn more and explore what comprehensivity is. For the bulk of this exploration, the juxtaposition format will be as follows. The topic area will be in the center on the top. Blake will be on the left, Fuller will be on the right. In the middle will be in black some commonalities or concordances, points of contact, areas of alignment, provocative connections, realms of ongoing exploration. On the left side will be images and texts related to Blake. On the right side will be images and texts related to Fuller. And some general juxtapositional questions. What depth of field do we gain through juxtapositions? A question contributed by Dean. What is it to ride a bicycle, not just two unicycles? Why not just two separate presentations? What is unity and why is it at minimum two? Famous Fuller quote. First, the life and times. Blake lived from 1757 to 1827. Fuller lived from 1895 to 1983. Blake was born in London and spent 3 years at a relatively close location in Felpham, Sussex, South England. Otherwise spent his life in and around London. Fuller was born in the USA. He went on many travels and documented extensively his movement around spaceship Earth, what he called it, by land, sea, air, and mind. Blake married with Catherine Boucher in 1782. When he was 25, they had a lifelong relationship. And kind of analogously, Fuller married with Anne Hewlett in 1917. When he was 22, they also had a lifelong relationship. Catherine of Blake wrote, "I have very little of Mr. Blake's company. He is always in paradise." The Fullers had 2 daughters, Alexandra and Allegra. The Blakes did not have any children. And just an anecdote about their relationships. Mr. Fuller once observed, "When two people as diametrically different as Anne and I get married, it either cracks up right away or it turns out to be fantastically good the way it has been for us." And an anecdote about Blake. The Blake strange leisure activities live on through an anecdote told by Blake's friend Thomas Butts. When he came to visit the Blakes in their small summer house at Lambeth, Butts was stunned to see the Blakes completely naked, but Blake was unfazed. "Come in," Blake purportedly cried. "It's only Adam and Eve, you know." The Blakes were simply reciting Paradise Lost in character. About their times. Blake had an early inclination for the arts, and in his age 10 to 14 range, had some classical drawing training. He continued developing his skills in drawing and engraving. His life was full of diligent, prolific, eccentric, aesthetic production, and it was a different time, so it's hard to know or compare, but he lived a humble and challenging life of exhibitions and patronage and just the day-to-day of being a craftsperson and an artist. Fuller, in his early life, was in school in the U.S. Navy and working in industry and maybe startup-like businesses in different areas. There's biography works where, for both of them, more details can be provided. And at 32, Fuller had a transformative experience where he decided to, as a bundle of experience his life as guinea pig bee and testing what one normal person could do. He documented with a lifelong chronophile as a personal archive, which we'll come to later, and he lived an extravagant life. And here extravagant is in the sense of Thoreau in Walden, who wrote, "I fear chiefly lest my expression may not be extravagant enough, may not wander far enough beyond the narrow limits of my daily experience so as to be adequate to the truth of which I have been convinced. Extravagance. It depends on how you are yarded." And that Thoreau quote is a little bit of a throwback to Fuller's transcendentalist roots. About their practices and professions. Both of them sought independence through insight, inquiry, and creation, action, in lifelong development. So Fuller famously said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And one of the really powerful verses of Blake from Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, was, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create." So that resonates with Fuller's emphasis on creation. And one note that we'll return to with Blake is these lines, although sometimes they're copy and pastable and typed out like they are here, these lines are essentially always within the context of these engraved plates or plates created with different artistic styles that Blake worked with. And both Blake and Fuller exhibited craft skill and commitment, as well as a sometimes reckless or ambitious or bizarre professionalism across different forms, genres, and communities. So in terms of some output formats or areas of attention for them that were shared, books, poems, stories, myths and mythologies, marginal annotations, diverse visual arts, written and spoken work, mass and personal communications, long-term relationships, and physical spaces like workshop, classroom, domestic spaces. About Fuller's specific works, just to name a few categories or top-of-mind ones, in terms of paradigms, themes, and memes that Fuller advanced, synergetics and tensegrity. Synergetics, the geometry of thought, and tensegrity, alternating compression and tension physical structures. 4D time lock, anticipatory design science, Dymaxion geodesic architecture. Fuller made many patents. He used many new words, and he had an operationalist focus and a pragmatic approach towards processes and constructions in the era that he was living and working. And that includes areas like industry, physical tools, housing, and the pivot from weaponry to livingery, cars and transportation, communications and intelligence systems, and architectures. Blake, in addition to the middle column, worked sometimes musically, apparently sang, though it wasn't recordable at the time. And Blake worked primarily with visual and poetic aesthetic media methods, drawings and woodcuts and relief etching, what he called the illuminated printing or infernal method. Sometimes Blake was working from his own imagination in a poetic, artistic fashion. Other times he was taking commission and doing illustrations for others' work. So he wasn't making the text, but he would make different accompanying pieces. The infernal method is really interesting and speaks to a central feature in what Blake must have spent a lot of his time working on, as well as thinking about and using as a metaphor. So, describing the infernal method from vic.gov.au. He used an acid-resistant liquid and drew and wrote, composing directly onto the copper plate with brushes and a quill pen. When the acid-resistant liquid dried and hardened, the plate would be exposed to acid, which etched away the uncovered parts of the copper. Because printing always reverses the design, the text had to be written backwards and slanted appropriately in order to appear the right way round when printed. The evolution in Blake's approach to illuminated printing that accompanied this change has been described as a shift from the idea of print as page to print as painting. And one way that Blake poetically described it in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell was, first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. Both Blake and Fuller had a deep generativity, reflected here in just a few different ways. On Blake, the Blake Archive is the central resource that hosts links to the illuminated books, commercial book illustrations, separate prints and series, drawings and paintings, manuscripts and typographic works, and all works of Blake. So it's an incredible catalog, and not all of it even persists or is digitized, as far as I understand. And also we see Blake-related generativity continuing to this day with publications and communities like Blake Quarterly, who are continuing to do work, and people who continue to do research and citations around Blake. And there's various full Blake poetry and prose publications, as well as publications and books with a focus on the art pieces in their visual original format, which we'll see soon, and also dictionaries that capture these England and Middle East and globally located entities and myths, and also invented places and names in Blake's work. Fuller's deep generativity can be viewed from a few ways. One is the Dymaxion Chronophile, the most documented life in history, Wired article, and from the wiki of Dymaxion Chronophile. Fuller's Chronophile contains over 140,000 pieces of paper, as well as 64,000 feet of film, 1,500 hours of audio tape, and 300 hours of video recording, etc. And the Chronophile documented some or a large amount of Fuller's itineraries and collaborations. And to this day, we see interest in the books by and about Fuller, articles by and about Fuller, patents, various other works, also dictionaries and related work, which brings the content from the construction and analytical into the programming language and computer science related, like the work of Kirby and grunge.net. And Fuller's generativity is also shown formally here in collaboration with E.J. Applewhite, most centrally in Synergetics, whereas Blake's work also contains a gradient from the most essentially mythological, like the sections and relationships described that are most informative about this deeper mythology that generates the work. And similarly, there's a formality to informality, as well as very endearing communications to and from both of them. Blake and Fuller worked across the full page, and there's a few interesting ways to see it. Just a small sample of different images shown here. So here's an example of a poem or some text of Blake, which might be pulled out and able to be copied and pasted as plain text in Thunders Ends the Voice. Continuing from there, but sometimes pages have no text. Sometimes the page is a lot of text. Sometimes it's a little bit. There's a lot of different formats and text ratios that Blake worked with. And these pieces have a lot of variation in color and style. And also sometimes they have a lot of motifs that occur again and again over the years. So just visually, there's always amazing things to see in Blake. Fuller also worked across the whole page, whether it was with blueprints and engineering drawings for the construction of domes, cars, or other areas, or whether it was more like a scientific poster or even image meme that was describing some feature in Synergetics, or just the hundreds of images in Synergetics and other illustrations that were used by Fuller to represent different aspects of Synergetics or of energy usage on Earth, always cramming detail into the full page. One interesting thought in perhaps both cases, but certainly for Blake's case, this fusion text and layout aesthetic ensures that although the plain text can be read off, as long as people know that the poem originally was made in this format, then there may be context in the rest of the picture that the artist may have intended to include. One might have a view on art where it doesn't really matter what Blake thought, but I guess it's something you might want to know. Fuller also retains the uniqueness of some of his imagery generated because it uses timeless visualizations, like related to the nesting of different shapes and forms, as well as very timepiece representations. So also a lot of visuality in Fuller. About children and education. Both Blake and Fuller highlighted accessibility for children in age and in spirit, and all kinds of learners. So, first about Fuller. Fuller wrote works like An Educational Revolution is Upon Us and Every Child is Born a Genius. Those are quotes from Every Child is Born a Genius. And he wrote, I observe that every child demonstrates a comprehensive curiosity. Children are interested in everything and are forever embarrassing their specialized parents by the wholeness of their interests. And there's some books that are by and about Fuller and children, like Fuller's Earth, A Day with Buckminster Fuller and the Kids by Richard Brenneman, which is describing Fuller hanging out with some larvae. And there was the work Tetrascroll, Goldilocks and the Three Bears and Goldilocks, that's making 4. So tetrahedra, minimum system, a cosmic fairy tale. And this work had a very interesting physicality in terms of being printed on triangular pages and wrapped into some shape, hence tetrascroll. But there was only a limited number of those made, and hence most people read it in the regular book format or even the digital format. One interesting crossover is from the preamble to Synergetics, written by E.J. Applewhite in 1986. And Applewhite wrote, "On the opening page of Synergetics, Fuller exhorts the reader, dare to be naive. Similarly, in speaking, he tended to address professors as if they were 9-year-olds and 9-year-olds as if they were professors. This is a strategy that was anticipated by William Blake, who, quote, liked to think that his works were perfectly comprehensible to the innocent, to minds not blunted by education and fashion, especially children." So that's a interesting crossover, an Applewhite mediated crossover from Fuller to Blake. Blake, here, I'll quote from the hypertexts. They wrote, "Blake certainly had a wonderfully tender heart for children. He was a peerless child advocate who, through his poetry and visual art, called for his fellow Englishmen to see and respond to the plight of children forced to work long, grueling, hazardous hours, providing virtual slave labor to unscrupulous businessmen. Among major writers, perhaps only Charles Dickens rivals Blake as an illustrator of the plight of orphans and street urchins. No great poet ever wrote more compassionately or more frequently about children than William Blake." So very sweet by hypertext. Here is the cover of Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. And this dialectic or relationship between and among innocence and experience is a central motif in Blake's work, and it's embodied in these sets of songs that come from an innocent or an experienced perspective, and seeing that as a fractal, childing, adulting, developing process. And here, from William Blake's treatment of childhood in his poems, the glorification of childhood is a dominant romantic figure of Blake's poetry. In his poems, child is a figure symbolizing God or Christ. His world of innocence, however, is not entirely untouched by unpleasant dreams. So, pretty interesting that they both have such a focus on talking to everyone in this eternal, idealized, but also experienced view on childhood. Symmetries is a theme that comes up again and again in their works. They both paid keen attention to visual and symbolic symmetries in thought, history, biology, everything. So first, Fuller. Looking up symmetry in the Synergetics Index from R.W. Gray, one can see many times that symmetry arises in the work, and also in other explicitly and implicitly used ways. So symmetry is everywhere in Synergetics, and just to show a few representations of TETs, self, truth, beauty, and symmetry. Here's an example of an image that one finds in his work, combining angles and calculations with shapes and how they fit together, how different modules and symmetries work. And it was also embodied in physical buildings and constructions. Last image from Fuller and Synergetics. Here in the regular tetrahedron, there are 6 planes of symmetry. This is a formal symmetry, and it's described often in those visualizations and also in text. So here's Synergetics 532, where the mentions of symmetry are shown So many of these are formal statements. Some of them are more associative. That's one opportunity for more formal ontologies of synergetics. One of Blake's most famous oft-quoted lines are, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" And so here is the tiger burning bright, just out there in their niche. And that notion of fearful symmetry comes up other times in Blake's work, and it also unfolds in implicit ways, such that it's become a central motif for scholars and an organizing point of understanding for Blake's work. So Stephanie Vest has some materials, Don't Fear the Symmetry, the poetry of William Blake, and also Fearful Symmetry, a study of William Blake, was the title chosen by literary critic Northrop Frye. So it just shows that those who want to give one snippet of Blake to entice someone to read this biography or critical perspective, sometimes this symmetry or the fearful symmetry gets included in that. And perhaps, as we might expect from that emphasis from the qualitative side, the symmetry notion, and also returning back towards Fuller and synergetics in a Hermann Hakan sense, there is work like Fearful Symmetry, The Search for Beauty in Modern Physics by AZ, and Symmetry and Complexity, Spirit and Beauty of Nonlinear Science by Mainzer, and a lot of other related work, Quark and the Jaguar by Murray Gell-Mann. And this just shows the fearful symmetry and the symmetry breaking and making of life and perception and action that Blake evokes, finds representation and manifestation in modern complexity science. Formal components of complexity science, like simulation and fractals and physics shown here, but also the relational aspects of complexity. So also cool with Blake and symmetries. And their symmetries were not just mirrors, and their systems were not just dyadic. Both had what can be called a fourfold vision. Blake and Fuller used fourfold mnemonics to summarize systems, physical and cognitive systems, in terms of a unified while compositional, geometrical, tetrahedral nature. First, with Blake to introduce the fourfold vision. So, fourfold vision is I'll go to the David Grove's citation from Blake, Thomas Boston, and the fourfold vision. The word fourfold or fourfold appears many times in Blake's longer poems and is clearly one of his favorite expressions. Probably the best known example occurs in his letter to Thomas Butts. "Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Belua's night, and twofold always may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." And Groves writes, "The word fourfold can be found twice in the 1611 Bible and once in Paradise Lost by Milton, but its frequent use by Blake is very striking. Contemporary readers may have detected an echo of Thomas Boston's book Human Nature in its fourfold state, a popular work of theology which went through at least 24 editions in Britain between 1720 and 1800. So this fourfoldness has been the focus of scholarly work, like Fourfold Visions of William Blake and Martin Heidegger by Marcel O'Gorman, and the work of Dora Janzer. Four mighty ones are in every man, the development of the fourfold in Blake. So work specifically on fourfoldness. What did the four mean for Blake? To give a short example or summary, Here are some lines. 4 mighty ones are in every man. A perfect unity cannot exist, but from the universal brotherhood of Eden, the universal man, to whom be glory evermore. Amen. And from Ramhorned. Albion, which is the fourfold man, has a composite character second to none. It means originally England, but at a deeper level, it means the cosmos, which is a man. In this, Blake agrees with the Adam Kadmon of the Kabbalah, the heavenly man of Philo, St. Paul's heavenly man, the second Adam, and the cosmic man of Gnostic mythology, and the Hindu god Krishna. So, other people have represented it differently. Here's the Blake Schumacher system, and the fourfold single, double, triple, and fourfold vision are shown, and the role of the spirit in integrating, and this is pretty interesting visualization. So not just for Synergetics, but also for Blake, some more formal ontology approaches could help us extract the associations that are made with single, double, triple, and fourfold vision, and then see those represent this kind of material across the work. Fuller's fourfold vision, just also to provide one entry point, is the tetrahedron, or call it what you like. Univol, tetraorbs, tet. Tet is the minimum system, and in Synergetics, tet has an edge length of 1 and a volume of 1. So in the CGS system, which is the cube defining system, 1 centimeter cubed is 1 gram of water at 4 degrees C, and 1 by 1 by 1 equals 1 volume. Here, the tet, as assembled here from 2 zigzags, both reaction, action, resultant events, positive and negative events, edges, 6 edges coming together to make the univol. 1 positive plus 1 negative event equals tetrahedron. So that's the centrality of the tet as minimum omni-triangulated system, the minimum space enclosing system, and because of its primacy in terms of edge and vertex usage to enclose space, because of its primacy as minimum system, it is given an edge length of 1 and a volume of 1, and there's so much other geometric connections that can be made to and from the tetrahedron that it's not a tet-only system, but the tet is the minimum system. Fuller also said unity is plural and at minimum 2. That speaks to this 1 positive and 1 negative event composing the tet. And one other fun equation related to the fourfold vision is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1 for events, energy happenings at the 4 vertices equals 1 system. And universe is the entire system. Every other system is a scenario. It's a subsystem of universe, and its structure is geometric. Today, what we might say a Bayesian causal graph, and that structure is minimum tetrahedral, but in many cases is going to be a different structure, and that's the structure of thinking. For it comes up from the earliest of works of Fuller. For example, 4D time lock. Here's the classic 4D logo. And the work continues to this day and is indeed extended. Here is from Martian Math by Kirby Erner. Awesome on-paper representations, but also extensive open source code and educational materials and repositories around Martian Math and the School of Tomorrow that help bring these visualizations formal and associations that are introduced and in Fuller's work, but also moving it forward, being able to represent the classics and do new things as well. And the fourfold vision has been explored on 52 Living Ideas as well. So on the Blake side, there was The Fourfold Vision and the Age of Imagination with Yasuhiko Kimura, New Spirituality of the Future. And there was a work by Shrikant, Fourfold Vision, Why, What, How, Who, and Exploration, and many others who have brought their fourfold Blakean perspective. And also on the Fuller side, there have been many presentations in the past and to come on Fuller, so just check that out. On the topic of negations and contradictions, Blake and Fuller use logical paradigms which distinguish between negation, not A, and contradiction, which is complement to A. And they developed, embodied, and elaborated that paradigm into an art, myth, and application area and beyond, thus truly generating a system of their own. Classic lines from Blake's Jerusalem. Negations are not contraries. Contraries mutually exist, but negations exist not. That's from Marriage in Heaven and Hell. Also, without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. In the work of Russell Prather, William Blake, and the Problem of Progression, Prather wrote, the paper begins by considering Blake's appropriation of the term contraries and its limitations in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. It then focuses on a short passage at the beginning of the Four Zoas that extends the marriage twofold conception of contraries into a fourfold complement of contraries and subcontraries, four possibilities that the passage, disregarding basic rules of logic, synodically embraces. Here's that representation of contraries and subcontraries and subalternations with a formal structure, just like the shapes of synergetics can be nested and interfaced. Perhaps statements of Blake and also Blake's style of nested rhetoric and mythology could be woven and unwoven. And work from this link on this slide. Without contraries is no progression, in view of Blake's The Lamb and the Tiger. So these cross-modality associations like innocence and experience, lamb and the tiger, contraries and progression, all of these come up explicitly and implicitly in Blake. Fuller had his own way of describing these issues around negation and contradiction. So from Synergetics 445.11. At eternal outset, the vector equilibrium's frequency is non-none, which is inactive, which is different in meaning from non-existent. Zero is the inside-out phase of conceptual integrity. It is the eternal complementation of system. Quite the contrary to non-existent, it means only eternally existent in contrast to temporarily existent, temporarily existent. Experience is all temporary. Between experiences is the forever eternal metaphysical, which cannot be converted into existence. So the vector equilibrium is 12 points that radiate equally spaced out from this center point. And it also reflects the packing of 12 around 1, and it traces out this shape. And the movement amongst different shapes, Fuller is not saying that real life forms are always perfect, idealized crystal forms like this, but that thought structures have these modes that they pass through in their stabilities and intertransformabilities. I'm sure there's many other ways to think about it, but if there are this many terms on the table, there is some shape which maybe in some latent space it doesn't have this crystal structure, but maybe there is a transformation or a way to stretch or ignore distances and rearrange the points to look like that. And so then if the points did look like that, what would be the integrity of that structure? There's a lot of ways to look at what the geometry of thinking really are. And here is from, I believe, Latest Impressions, a plot of some of the relationships among different shapes. And there's many other shapes and directions and ways that one could imagine this work become interactive. But there's things that are brought up again and again by Fuller as things that are just unity of plural and minimum 2. For example, from everything I know. We have then, I found, there is what you call a multiplicative 2 and an additive 2. There was an additive 2 of the poles for every system in the universe. There was also a multiplicative 2 because there is a concave and a convex. There is inherent duality of this congruence of an inside system because concave and convex are not the same. You just have to realize that you have a fundamental congruence of the macrocosm and microcosm. There is negative and positive, simply congruent there, but you can't separate them. So that speaks to when you have, for example, system closure, there are topological changes induced that are +2, but also there are qualitative transformations induced because you introduce an insideness and an outsideness once you have system, which is to say space enclosure, tet. And then to kind of return to that vector equilibrium, I want you to realize then that you're going to find in closest packing that the arrangement of centers of spheres and centers of spaces in this arrangement, where you are suddenly going to discover that the vector equilibrium, I gave you originally the vector equilibrium flat, and then I gave you where it curved the edges, where it became convex or it could be concave. The same vector equilibrium can become concave or it can become convex, and so can the octahedron. So we have then spaces that suddenly become spheres, they blow up, and the spaces contract. So there's something terribly exciting going on here. So yet another way to kind of see what these wireframes can be is to think about how every, not every single representation, but a vast many drawings or figures in Synergetics can be seen as a duality between this vertex and edge drawing and close packing spheres, hence the way of the spheres, as some call it. Also, there's the great circles view with lines of symmetry and lines that are arbitrarily designed to go through certain vertices, and ways of thinking of this shape expanding like one balloon or consisting of multiple inflated balloons. So there's just a lot of ways to geometrically show these distance relationships and also see them as 0 points or extrema of different transformations, which are like always the special cases while it's waggling and wobbling in the middle, but it has to pass through a phase transition like this this is the minimum energy crossover point. So it becomes its own archetype, like the pinch point of the hourglass. About perception, cognition, and action. Both Blake and Fuller exhibited artistic, skillful, and professional use of physical tools. They had lifelong development of their physical, social, and cognitive niche. They had a cosmic, dual, exoteric perspective on the function and meaning of human life and sense-making. And what I mean by dual, exoteric perspective or approach is that they called it like they saw it. What they said and meant to say, we now talk about, and it can be read at multiple levels. They were aware and attentive towards historical and global traditions and practices of inquiry and action. They situated their work expertly and explicitly in relationship to past, present, and future colleagues, For example, writing marginal comments or letters or personal notes, or having conversations about which other artists or thinkers or writers they did or didn't have different affinities with. But to really get to the substance of the perception, cognition, action loop, Blake wrote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." That's from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, right after describing the infernal method that was quoted earlier. And that vision of the doors of perception was used as the title of a famous work, The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. There's a lot of work that links Blake explicitly to the cognitive and the psychological, the cybernetic, like Blake in The Mark of the Cognitive, Notes Toward the Appearance of the Skeptical Subject, Shaw, 2019, recent work. William Blake's Integral Psychology, Reading Blake and Ken Wilber Together, Adams, 2006, so another juxtaposition work. Then here we have, in the Gutenberg Galaxy, McLuhan reformulates the Aristotelian Thomist concept of the sensus communis in terms of a sense ratio, a concept ostensibly adopted from William Blake. Quoting from Blake's poem Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, McLuhan asserts that Blake, quote, is concerned with the changing patterns of human perception. He says that Blake's theme is captured in these lines from Book 2, Chapter 34 of the poem. If perceptive organs vary, objects of perception seem to vary. If the perceptive organs close, their objects seem to close also. So, this is a proto-media is the message. And the media, our biological media, is our sense organ, observations, and our generative model, our cognitive apparatus for any cognitive system. And so, really interesting that McLuhan highlights those lines as central to the theme and foresages that media is the message and the embodiment is the medium, quite literally. And Blake wrote, in the universe, there are things that are known and things that are unknown, and in between there are doors. He also wrote, man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of a soul discerned by the five senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. McLuhan is a crossover point with Bucky. So here's a picture of McLuhan and Buckminster Fuller first meeting on an intellectual cruise around the Greek islands. Fuller wrote extensively about processes of sense, thinking, and acting. He wrote, since the initial publication of the chart of the electromagnetic spectrum, humans have learned that what they can touch, smell, see, and hear is less than 1/millionth of reality. We cannot perceive or discern every smell or pick up on every photon or understand every pattern that may or may not be in different regularities, let alone know what to do with them. And he takes this epistemic realist perspective very seriously, not just by describing its limitations, but by then going on to describe the centrality of the sense-making task in our role in scenario. And that played out in very rich and productive ways that are reflected in work like Daniel Lopez Perez, Pattern Thinking, Buckminster Fuller, and another Lars Muller publication that we read in Trim Tab Reading Group by Mark Wigley, Buckminster Fuller Inc., The Architecture in the Age of Radio. And from the description of that book, Bucky Inc. offers a deep exploration of Fuller's work and thought to shed new light on the questions raised by our increasingly electronic world. It shows that Fuller's entire career was a multidimensional reflection on the architecture of radio. He always insisted that the real site of architecture is the electromagnetic spectrum. His buildings were delicate mobile instruments for accessing the invisible universe of overlapping signals. Every detail was understood as a way of tuning into hidden waves. Architecture was built in, with, for, and as radio. And especially if we think about radio, wireless, and energy patterns, even of structural elements, unconventional computing, extended cognition, this is such a rich perspective on cyber-physical systems. And Fuller wrote Man and Universe, 1963, Critical Path, 1981, works about what we do and our role on the critical path. When trying to think of their worldview, I tried to keep it literal and describe the way that they actually viewed the world, peripersonal and global. Both Blake and Fuller had an intense, unique, charismatic worldview characterized by an emphasis on physicality and metaphysicality in a sort of qualified, dualist, non-dualisty way, evocative way, and describing the constraints, affordances of the brain and the body. They took authentic perspectives on history and understandings of people and ideas, so they had their own takes, and sometimes it aligns with different things, but it was what it was, and they put it out there, and we can read it. Deep fractal mythologies, personal, national, global, and cosmic, scattered across their works. So having these motifs, words, and images and patterns that speak to these deep perspectives on some of the topics we've been looking through. Their tone can be ambiguous. Is it a prophecy, prediction, an exhortation, or what? So they wrote in many different formats and tones, and part of that speaking across genres is something that gives their work such staying power to this day. They had intense criticisms and compliments of other ideas and people as contrast with their own work, and saw their work in the historical lineage of certain patterns of thinking or not. They were critics and visionaries about the relationship between and among humans, technology, and ecology. And they integrated their values, broader work practices, skills, income in different ways at different times. So Fuller, there's so much that could be said about his peripersonal and global worldview, but some representative images were the Dymaxion world map, a less distorting world map, unfoldable and refoldable, composable assembly approach, and the way that his technologies became operationalized around the world with the realized structures making a difference across the whole map. And a way that Blake viewed the world, this is from Milton, and the top part people can read, but to read the last lines. Such are the spaces called earth, and such its dimension. As to that false appearance which appears to the reasoner, as of a globe rolling through voidness, it is a delusion of Ulro. The microscope knows not of this, nor the telescope. They alter the ratio of the spectator's organs, but leave objects untouched. For every space larger than a red globule of man's blood is visionary. This invokes the previous slide's mention of McLuhan and the sense ratio. When Blake says the microscope knows not of this nor the telescope, they alter the ratio of the spectator's organ but leave objects untouched. When we look through the goggles into the microscope or the telescope, or data visualization of images coming off of them, we have a mental projection into a smaller or a larger space, like a molecular space or a cosmic space. But our sense organ is still viewing the peripersonal. So if we're reading a paper, it could be putting us more into our body and surroundings, aligning our conceptuality with our materiality, or the substance of that visual sensory experience could abstract or translocate us in our attention to think about another region of the world, or to generalize, abstract, particularize, learn, entertain, etc. But the objects are untouched. So the actual play is in the cognitive entity, not in the sense organs, which again refers back to this idea that the media is the message. That's not just saying, well, social media versus printed book versus etc. But the ultimate medium is the embodiment, our embodiment. And so the higher level than newspaper versus book versus social media of media differences, which are like differences in genre, format, affordances, and so on, the medium that we're in is the medium. And also there's a mention of the reasoner coming to believe that it's a globe rolling through voidness. It's a delusion of Ulro. And so it's statements like this that can be understood in the archetypes and personalities of these named entities, which one needs the Blake dictionary to unpack, basically. And whatever it is about the world's shape or our peripersonal perception, cognition, action, and imperative, both Blake and Fuller had a very positive view on what we could and must do about our situation. So Fuller famously had the mission of making the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. So Fuller and continued Fullerites are interested in making it work. Blake wrote, I'll just quote the central line, striving with systems to deliver individuals from those systems. So not just an understanding of systems, but striving with them and having this self-referential aspect of continual individual deliverance through system reflexivity. About their faith, they both had deep personal and family faith traditions that one can read more about in their works. They had complex and meaningful relationship with Christian as well as other faith and belief communities. Much of Blake's work was quintessentially religious, and one can read about that in so many other places. I'll just show a few off the top of head pieces. This is one of the last pieces that Blake made, and it shows this full page creativity and integration of Old Testament, New Testament, Greco-Roman, idealistic, but also heterodox interpretations, and also the sheer complexity of interpretation, as well as transcription into plain text of the forms that Blake presented. Here, let's read some lines. So many lines could be pulled out, so not to be overgeneralized, to represent Blake's complex relationship with faith traditions, but an example from the Marriage of Heaven and Hell that speaks to this infernal interpretation. The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have learned from hell. For the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life, and when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas now it now appears finite and corrupt. This will come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. But first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method, by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away, and displaying the infinite from which was hid. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. So, thought this was kind of a cool way to tie together a lot of the earlier themes. Here we have just a character or an archetype speaking. So again, all of these must be read in the context of their page and work and Blake's ontology. But here we have this contrarian, heterodox perspective speaking and prognosticating, exhorting, merely describing, who knows, a situation where there will be a consumption of creation such that it comes to appear infinite and holy, whereas today we see finitude and corruption, and that the path will be improvement of sensual enjoyment. This is a complex sensual enjoyment that Blake explores. And so following that heterodox but also deeply religious perspective and spiritual, as well as mystical in Blake's case particularly, or visionary, as many have said and debated his mystical and or visionary leanings, but ultimately it's just the work itself, though there's so much interesting other work. What comes next? The notion that was quoted earlier when we first looked at the infernal method, both the actual reverse and inverse etching that Blake actually used with corrosives and the infernal method, and then by analogy, this burning the excess away, melting apparent surfaces away, the infernal method as a way to display the infinite from which is hid, which is like the true hidden states in an active inference, free energy principle way. And then immediately following that multi-level description of the infernal method in terms of the heteropraxis of what is happening here, immediately following are the lines about the doors of perception. So it's just an example of the depth and the intensity of even the writing. And then the imagery has its own ineffable sense to it. Fuller wrote a lot of work, whether calling it different words of spirituality and religion. So he wrote and rewrote Ever Rethinking the Lord's Prayer, where we see quotes like, "Love is metaphysical gravity. I define universe as all of humanity's in all known time consciously apprehended and communicated to self or others experience. In using the word God, I am consciously employing four clearly differentiated from one another experience engendered thoughts. Minimum system 4 tat." He wrote, "My task was not to preach about God, but to serve God in silence about God." He wrote No More Secondhand God, and the famous quote, "Here's God's purpose. For God, to me, it seems, is a verb, not a noun, proper or improper." Famous quote. Last words. Give the last words to Blake and Fuller. Blake wrote, "Here lies William Blake, 1757 to 1827, poet, artist, prophet. I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate built in Jerusalem's wall." And that is from a section in Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion, called to the Christians, illustrated here. Fuller, on his gravestone, twice has Call Me Trim Tab. R. Buckminster Fuller, Call Me Trim Tab, July 12th, 1895 to July 1st, 1983, married July 12th, 1917, and Hewlett Fuller, January 9th, 1896 to July 3rd, 1983, 2 days afterwards. And below Fuller's name, and highest of all, Call Me Trim Tab. And a trim tab is the rudder that moves the rudder. It's the second order cybernetics. So, Call Me Trim Tab. A little bit of a Call Me Ishmael throwback, but it's how Fuller wanted to be known, clearly. And it's what we can all be. And it's the metaphor that moves a lot of people forward through complexity. So, with respect to William Blake and Buckminster Fuller, what can we say? There are complex and rewarding similarities, divergences, and resonances. There are multiple possible perspectives to take on this juxtaposition, or indeed any juxtaposition. And there's many salient paths of inquiry and action to pursue. These slides are downloadable and citable. This is an early communication of a complex project, so please reach out if you want to work in the area, if you have any questions. Stable Diffusion and ChatGPT both had some interesting things to communicate in response to prompts around this topic. So some custom corpus engineering could be awesome. And in discussion, we could go back to explore one of the previous areas of juxtaposition: life and times, approaches and practices, deep generativity, full-page creativity, children and education, symmetries, fourfold vision, negations and contradictions, perception, cognition, action, worldview, faith, closing words. Or we could start a juxtaposition page for a new topic, or return to one of the general single slide sections, context, comprehensivity, and conclusion. Or we could do something else. All right, this will conclude the live stream. There's always space for a new topic. There's always space for a topic other than Blake and Fuller. And there's always a blank page that we can get to. All right, hope you enjoy. Talk to you next time.